It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood, a neighborly day for a beauty. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? I have always wanted to have a neighbor
just like you.
I've always wanted to
obtain in something with you.
So
Let's make the most of this beautiful day.
Since we're together,
I might as well say, won't you be mine? Won't you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Won't you please? Please, won't you be my neighbor? Won't you please? Won't you please? Please, won't you be my neighbor?
Hey, neighbor.
I hope you guys have loved this series as much as I have. And if you haven't been at this series yet, you are wondering what just happened at church, right? Well, we are ending our series this weekend called Finding Fred. And I know, and I have loved this series. If you love this series, it's just been amazing. Yeah. And at age 7, I actually thought I would maybe one day be on Mr. Rogers with his puppets. And I convinced all of my friends that I would be a ventriloquist. I'm just really glad I gave up on that dream. There are some dreams not to give up on. That was one to give up on, right? And and I've loved this series, though, because it's reminded me of some really great things that I saw growing up, but most of all, it's been an amazing way of finding out how a believer, a follower of Christ, has followed Jesus in just a really tangible way through his life. Now, I would watch Mr. Rogers a little bit more than Sesame Street. My mom said it was a little bit more my pace. I'm like, I don't know, Mom. Just a way to build some confidence. But I loved it as a kid, and it was so fun to watch. And Fred Rogers, before being on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, he helped with a couple other shows. In fact, part of the way that Daniel Tiger came to being was he helped with this show where he would play piano and they'd show old film rolls. And the problem with old free film rolls is that they usually came to them brittle. And they'd usually break halfway through showing them. And so there was one time when Fred was on live and they were showing this film reel in the middle of a live broadcast, and it stopped working. And they had to scramble really quickly, and Fred found this old puppet that somebody had given him, and he found a part of the set, and he just stuck the puppet through. He made a hole in the set and started to talk to the host. Could you imagine being that host? This random puppet comes out from nowhere as you struggle. But that's where kind of Daniel Tiger, with a couple other things and a couple missing parts of that history, but that's part of where Daniel Tiger and some of the other puppets and this land of make-believe that we got to see on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood came to be. And it's so interesting to me that in the midst of a failed set, in the midst of a failed production that day, that something really great came out of it, that something continued to be formed out of it. And as we close out our Finding Fred series this week, I think it's easy to look at Fred's life and think, man, he had it all put together. Everything was good. Everything was right. And we get to see the highlights and the success of it. But sometimes that's all we see. And we do that in life a lot too, right? You jump onto social media and you see the highlights and you see the success and you see all the great things about somebody and you instantly see it all. And then even sometimes you see the most passionate posts about where someone stands out on an issue and why. And I think it's because our world is looking for superheroes. Now, you thought I was done with props, but I also, as a kid, I had a big adventurous imagination as a kid, but I also wore a cape half of my childhood. Yes, okay. Yeah. And so I ran around town with this. My parents, God bless them, they put up with some craziness as a kid. And I would put this cape on all the time, but it was different from this one. This one fits me. It had you know how a t-shirt has a neck to it and stuff? There came a point where it didn't fit anymore. And I just put it on my head and I tried. it didn't work, and finally my mom hid it, so I couldn't find it anymore. Just a small, trick. Parents hide the toys that you don't want them to play with anymore. And I realized, though, that superheroes just aren't real. And we keep looking for superheroes in our world. I think that's part of why social media is so huge for us. And I love it, and it's great, but at the same time, so many times we look for the superheroes in our world, and our world's looking for it. They're looking for hope, and they're looking for something. And it's even easy to look at Fred Rogers and say, man, that guy, he had it all put together. He had everything figured out. And at the same time, I wonder if Fred would ever accepted that. One of the interviews I watched, they talked about him, and they said, man, the hero that we've made him to be, he would never want that. He would just want people to know that he was simply available. He was available. And a question for us is, did Fred Rogers do enough? And maybe he thought so for a little bit. By 1976, Fred had lived and breathed children's television for more than 20 years. He found kid-friendly ways to cover things like death and assassination and segregation, but also haircuts and doctor's visits and moving to new homes. He felt like he had done enough. He felt like he had created a library of television visits that covered everything a child needed to know about growing up. And maybe that's what he thought, that maybe he had done it all at this point as he wrapped up what he thought would be his last show in 1976. And he showed the camera some shelves with VHS tapes. That's like this thing that you put in a VHS player, which doesn't help the explanation either. You can watch movies that way. Anyways, if you're not used to that. But he showed the camera those VHS tapes and said, we'll still be neighbors. It'll just look different. And with that, he ended Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And maybe Fred, as he wrapped that up, thought he had done enough. But the question is, could he have ever really done enough? I wonder what he would do if he walked into our world today, 2020. Where would he step in? What would he speak to in kids' lives, in adults' lives too? Would he have come back? And I think it's interesting that a few years later, Fred started Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood back up in 1979. His world and ours still continue to be met with challenges. And of course, when challenges come our way, we need help. And we need somebody to step in and walk with us. You see fear and hate creep in, and racism, and future generations are met again and again with the challenges and responsibilities of just living life. Now, I don't think Fred thought he was the answer to all of this, but he knew that he could be available. Maybe he could help kids and even people face what they needed to face. I love this. One of the child psychologists that he'd visit for advice on writing these episodes and writing these scripts, her name was Margaret McFarland, and she said, whatever is mentionable is manageable. Whatever is mentionable is manageable. And you want to talk about a show that met people right where they were. Met kids. We wouldn't mention some of the stuff he mentions, today on kids shows, just because it's awkward and it's hard and we want to avoid that stuff. One producer said that, if you wanted to, if you had everything that, the perfect kids show was made out of and you didn't do it for a kids show, that was Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And it's just such a weird way, but Fred made his way back to the set. Whatever is mentionable is manageable. And I think with that thought in mind, realizing that we needed to speak to something, we needed to meet these kids right where they were, they as a cast and crew stepped into it. But so many times in our adult lives, we don't mention things that need to be mentioned. We don't confront the things that need to be confronted. It's easier to pretend that we don't see the problems. We cover up and we hide and we look put together and we post all sorts of things on social media and even coming down to our polarizing views about where we stand on one subject or another. But here's the thing, our world doesn't need another social media post. Our world doesn't need something to just know about what you think about a certain topic, and sometimes that's important, and I get it, but the world doesn't need that necessarily. It doesn't need a superhero or even another Fred Rogers. It needs you. It needs you to jump in and bring your gifts to the table. The gifts that you can bring and you alone can bring to your family, to your work, to the church, to the city, to our nation. But too many times we're beaten down. We're too stuck to move forward. Between 1976 and 1979, that hiatus that Fred Rogers took from the show, he ran another show for grown-ups, and it was called Old Friends and New Friends. I could only really find one episode of it, and it wasn't really like critically acclaimed. It wasn't the greatest of shows in a lot of critics' places, but it met people where they were, but it just wasn't the place for Fred. And he realized as these needs continued to rise up in culture and society that he wasn't done yet. He wasn't done yet. And I love it that at one point he wrote down on a crumpled piece of paper this statement. He typed it. It said, "Am I kidding myself that I'm able to write a script again? Why don't I trust myself? After all these years, it's just as bad as ever. Oh well, the hour cometh, and now is when I've got to get to it." Get to it, Fred. What a brave thing to say to yourself in the midst of trying to get back into something, of trying to step back into something when you feel overwhelmed and feel like you don't have what it takes. You can't cut it yourself. And so many times, just like Fred, we feel stuck and we feel like we don't have a place. Sometimes we start to grow and things start to go well. Maybe you started even this whole quarantine season with a great workout plan and you started to do good, but like it's not. You're like, workout what? But more importantly, maybe you feel stuck because you feel like you take 2 steps forward and 20 steps back. Maybe you're in here today and you were 9 months sober, but you're on day 1 again. Maybe you're in here and you've dreamed of building a better family than the family that you grew up in because there are things that you know are possible for your family, but you don't know how to do it. Or maybe you want to create a better work culture, but you find yourself getting so frustrated with the way things are. That's the last thing you'll ever accomplish, you feel like. Or maybe you just want to make a difference somehow, but you wonder if you even have what it takes. I think Fred saw that. I think we definitely see that. But don't you remember? Superheroes, they're not real. Superheroes aren't real. And I love that the Bible is full of people like Fred and full of people like you and like me, who sometimes try to be superheroes. We try to pull it all together and we try to make it all work, and then we find out it's not going to work that way, and we realize just how much we need God to step in. And that's where becoming available takes place. There's this story that starts in Luke chapter 5 about 2 friends that met. See, Jesus was beginning what we call his ministry. He was beginning to reach people with the hope of what he was bringing into our world, and this crowd was following him down a hillside to some water, the Sea of Galilee. And as they were making their way down, Jesus had just finished teaching before in another place, and they were here, ready to hear what Jesus would say. And Jesus sees 2 fishing boats, and he gets in one. The fishermen probably were wondering what in the world was going on because they're cleaning their nets off to the side. And he gets in the boat, and he looks at this guy named Peter, and he said, "Hey, will you push this out just a little bit so that I can talk to these people?" Because in that setting, you could go there today even, in that setting, if you sit on the water, you can actually project your voice even just with a talking level, and a crowd could hear you. And so Jesus sits down in Peter's boat, and he starts to talk to the people. He finishes his talk, and he moves on, and the people move on, and Jesus looks at Peter, and he said, "Hey, let's go out to some deeper waters. And I want you to put your nets down, the nets you just cleaned, and see if you can catch anything. And Peter, a seasoned fisherman, looks at Jesus and says, like, we've been fishing all night, and we're just finishing cleaning our nets. Like, this isn't going to work. And Jesus just kind of, I can imagine, just sits there and looks at him. And Peter says, okay, if you think we're going to catch something, let's go for it. So they go out to the deeper waters, and Peter puts down the nets, and they end up catching so many fish that they need both boats to bring it back in. They've got 2 boats out there, and they need both boats to bring it back in. And Peter, realizing that there's something special about this guy, that this crowd had come out to hear speak, and this guy who had sat in his boat, Peter, realizing that, like, this guy is special, he looks at Jesus and he says, get away from me, I'm a mess. I'm a hot mess. I'm a sinner. I'm a mess. And he tells Jesus to get away from him. And Jesus says, don't worry, because I'm going to teach you how to be a fisher of men, how to fish for humankind. And that begins the relationship that Jesus and Peter have. And I love this beginning of the story is that Jesus says, don't be afraid. I've got a job for you to do. And it's much more than these fish. So let's fast forward a few years. Jesus and Peter had spent a lot of time together. Jesus and all of the disciples had spent a lot of time together for about 3 years. And at this point, we're going to jump into John chapter 13. And they've been through thick and thin. Like, they've lived some life together. And what happens in John 13 is Jesus and his followers are sitting together in a room, and Jesus is telling them what's going to probably happen next. They think probably. Jesus knows it's going to happen. And he says, hey, I'm going to die soon for all of humanity. I'm going to give up my life. I'm going to be captured. I'm going to be put on trial. I'm going to give up my life for all of humanity. And Peter speaks up. He says, hey, we've been through thick and thin. We've been through a lot together. There's no way I'm going to let you die. In fact, I'll die for you. Like, I'm good. Like, I'll give up my life for you. And Peter says, basically, I've got this. I'm here for you through thick and thin. And Jesus told him, this had to have hurt, but Jesus looks at him and says, hey, you'll deny me 3 times before the rooster crows in the morning. And I wonder if Peter thought that maybe he was a superhero too. That he thought he could hold it all together, that he could do it all himself. But Jesus knew, and it was okay with Jesus. Sometimes we put unreal expectations on ourselves too. We even get all pumped up here on the weekend at church and we sing that new song and it's amazing and it's good, and we get home and something just throws us. We get to work and somebody just gets us so frustrated, and the last thing we want to do is live with purpose, and we see all these things and it just falls apart. But again, there's no such thing as a superhero. There's no such thing. But we keep thinking there is. In 1979, when Fred Rogers was getting ready to return to Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, around that time, a little boy named Charles Green, 4 years old, went with his dad to the movies to see Superman. And ever since he saw Superman, he said, I can fly. So he'd find a chair and he'd jump off that chair in the house and he'd pretend to fly. And he'd find a table and he'd believe that he could fly. And then one day he went to visit his grandma, and he was playing in his grandma's apartment, and he opened up the window and he said, I can fly. And he jumped out the 7th floor window of his grandma's apartment in Brooklyn. And he died shortly after because he believed there was such a thing as a superhero. Fred had heard about this in the process of already starting back up his show, and he realized that he wasn't done with the work he was doing. In fact, the first week back, he spent the entire week talking to that very thing of make-believe, of not just puppets and the land of make-believe and trolleys and different things, but he spoke directly to what had happened in that situation. If we could only realize that there's no such thing as a superhero. Fred Rogers knew it. And in that first episode back, He spent time teaching kids that there's no such thing as a superhero. And I wanted to show you a clip because I think it just helps us understand, like Fred was so passionate about speaking to people right where they were at, right in the midst of the problems that they were facing.
That's a big place, isn't it? Well, that's the way it is with all those superheroes and monsters and things on television and the movies. They're just pictures, or somebody dressed up in a costume. They're not real, but they often look real, and they look so big. We'll go back there and see more tomorrow. Right now, I'd like to show you some of these pictures. See if you know these special superheroes. Superman, Wonder Woman, Spider-Man. You probably know a lot of others too. But you could also make up your own. Yeah, you could draw them, make them out of clay. Sure, you have your own ideas. And you yourself don't have to be any kind of super strong or super smart or super anything. No, just the way you are. It's you I like. It's not the things you wear. It's not the way you do your hair. But it's you I like. The way you are right now. Way down deep inside
You don't have to be super
you.
strong or super smart or super anything. You just have to be you. Fred got it. And he knew these kids needed it, and even more so, I think, for us as adults. He knew that we needed to understand that there's no such thing as a superhero, so stop trying to be somebody that you're not, but be exactly who God's made you to be. Because it's you God likes. It's you he loves. It's you. The story with Jesus and Peter continues. See, in John chapter 18, Jesus was on trial at this point, and Peter and the rest of the disciples had split. They were trying not to be caught as well, and so they kind of out of fear just had kind of split and scattered. And Peter, maybe in an attempt to just kind of see what was going on, found himself in a courtyard where he could maybe hear a little bit of the trial that Jesus was going through. And there in that courtyard, it was cold that evening, and so they had lit a charcoal fire, and the smell of that charcoal had fallen through his nose, his nostrils, and he smelled that as he sat by that fire and overheard a little bit of the trial. As Jesus spoke truth about who he was, somebody walked up to Peter and said, "Hey, aren't you one of the guys that followed Jesus?" He said, No, that's not me. And somebody else walked over and said, "Hey, aren't you the one that follows Jesus? You're one of them that followed Jesus." And he said, No, that's not me. And finally, somebody else spoke up a third time and said, "Hey, even in the way you talk, like your accent as you deny it, like gives you away. You're one of Jesus' followers." And he says, "No." And just like that, on cue, the rooster crows. Peter's cut to the heart. Peter realizing what he had done. He had made this huge promise, and there in that courtyard in front of that fire had denied Jesus. And we find ourselves so often in that same spot. We're met with fear and disruption at every turn in our relationships, our work, our health, our finances, our families. And so we plan and we strive and we struggle and we try to scramble and pull everything together and making pledges that we'll never be able to keep. But we were never made to be a superhero. And just like Peter, just like Fred had his moments, just like me, we all fail. And we will fail. Uplifting, right? That's where we go. But we fail. And here's the thing, though. This is the amazing thing about how God's truth meets us right where we're at. We might fail, but failure isn't fatal. Failure isn't fatal. See, what happens next with Jesus and Peter is Jesus is executed. And the last thing we read about Peter for a bit is that he denied Jesus. And then a few days later, there were rumors that Jesus' tomb, his grave, was empty. Some women that were followers of him showed up, and they realized that the tomb is empty. They came back and told Peter and another follower of Jesus, and Peter and this other guy run, and they go, and the tomb's empty. They don't see anything, but it's empty. A few days more go by, and the disciples, Jesus' followers, are in a room together, and Jesus shows up to show them that he had risen from the grave. And still, even then, we don't even hear anything about Peter in that moment. I don't know if he was there, if maybe he was just too quiet in that moment. I'm not sure, but whatever it was, a few days later, he goes back to just doing what he knew how to do. He finds a fishing boat and he says, hey, I'm going fishing. And a few of the guys jump in the water with him and climb into the boat, and they go fishing. They fish all night and they don't catch anything. It's like if I tried fishing. I'm a terrible fisherman. Like, they fish all night and they don't catch anything. These are pro fishermen. And this guy walks up to the shoreline and yells out to them, hey, have you caught anything? They say, no, we've been fishing all night. We haven't caught anything. And the guy on the shore just yells back to them, hey, why don't you throw the nets on the other side? They must have been like, who is this guy on the edge of the water? Like, what is he talking about? We're the pros. There's no fish to be had. But they throw the nets on the other side anyways. And what happens is that those fish start basically jumping in that net. They catch 153 fish. It says that the nets were too full almost to bring him back to shore. And I wonder if it was at that moment that Peter realized that was Jesus standing on the shore calling to him. Stepping back into Peter's space of his life, just like he did when he stepped into Peter's boat. And Peter jumps in the water. He's not waiting for the boat to get back. And he jumps in the water and he swims to Jesus. And they're on the shore. They're right on the shore. Jesus has a little charcoal fire going. He's fishing. He's cooking a fish and some bread. Now, that sounds like a terrible breakfast for me. I don't know. Talk to me later. Tell me about it if that's your deal. But I just find it so interesting. He's cooking this fish and this bread over a charcoal fire. And I think Peter remembered at that moment. He remembered the last time he smelled a charcoal fire, just maybe, was when he denied Jesus. When he turned his back on Jesus in his hour of need. And there Jesus meets him, and he meets us. Over that charcoal fire, Peter had to have remembered. And what happens next is this little conversation. I would imagine they just got up and they walked down the shore together. In John 21, 15 through 17, it says, after they had breakfast, Jesus said to Peter, Simon, son of John, do you burn with love for me more than these? Peter answered, yes, Lord. You know that I have great affection for you. Then take care of my lambs, Jesus said. Jesus repeated his question a second time. And Simon, son of John, do you burn with love for me? And Peter answered, yes, my Lord. Like, you know that I have great affection for you. Then take care of my sheep, Jesus said. And Jesus asked him again, Peter, son of John, do you have great affection for me? Do you love me? Peter was saddened by being asked a third time. He said, my Lord, you know everything. You know that I burn with love for you. Jesus replied, then feed my lambs. See, Jesus showed up again in the midst of Peter's failure, in the midst of the time when Peter felt like he had nothing left. There was this charcoal fire. Peter no doubt remembered the last charcoal fire he had stood by, but here Peter's invited to identify himself not as denying Jesus, but as loving Jesus. as loving Jesus. And Jesus stepped into Peter's failure, and he steps into ours. He steps into ours, not in a way that pushes us down and destroys us, but how does Jesus step in? He doesn't hide or avoid the topic of our failure. He steps right into it. Remember, whatever is mentionable is manageable. Well, Jesus exposes Peter's failure. Jesus and Peter clearly know about his failure, yet gently Jesus brings it up in a really simple way, in a gentle way. And next, Jesus dealt with his brokenness. And Jesus deals with our brokenness. He gave Peter a second and even a third chance. Do you love me, Peter? Peter, taking every advantage of making things right, said, oh, you know I love you. He let Jesus in to make things right. And I love this next part. Jesus doesn't just make things right. Jesus enables us to move forward. He said, feed my lambs. Take care of my sheep. Feed my lambs. Maybe another way to put it was, hey, I'm going to make you a fisher of men again, of humankind, to bring hope to the world in a way that you thought you had failed too much to ever accomplish again. He stepped into Peter's boat years earlier. He stepped again into Peter's world, and he steps into the spaces of our lives too, if we'll just simply allow him in. Sometimes it's helpful to talk about it just lived out in a real and genuine way, and I think Fred Rogers lived it out, and I was thinking about this message, this idea that superheroes aren't real, but so many times we get so caught up and think we can be, and then we fail, and we realize that hopefully we let Jesus in to show us that failure isn't fatal. And I was thinking about this missionary couple in Sweden. They had a heart to reach people with Jesus. They made themselves available, and they said, hey, we're going to move with another couple down to the Congo, and we're going to do ministry there, and we want to share Jesus with a village there. And so their hope was, hey, we want to bring the hope of Jesus into this world in a new way, to a new people group. And so they moved down to the Congo. They had high hopes of what they could accomplish. They get down there, they make their way into this village that they had only heard about, and find out that they can't even move into the village. They have to live on the outskirts. The chief of that village wouldn't let them talk to anybody in the village, and so finally they negotiated something, and somehow they were able to pay this young child to come and sell them some food. It's the only person in the village that they could communicate with, that they could talk to, and their language barrier was broken. But over time, as the months passed, they got to share the hope of Jesus with this little boy. But the months continued and nothing seemed to happen. God, we made ourselves available to you. Nothing's happening. They argued, the two couples that had moved down there together, about what to do. And finally, one of the couples moved back. And yet David and Svea Flood decided that they would stay. See, Svea was pregnant and they had a baby on the way. And it wouldn't be safe for them to make the journey out of the Congo during that time. So Svea gives birth to this beautiful baby girl, and they named her Aggie. Sweet Aggie. Born there on the edge of this village. But just a few days later, because of the childbirth and because of the pain and her dwindling health, Svea, Aggie's mom, died. David was suddenly a single dad. God, I made myself available to you, and this is all I have to show for it. This is all I've got. He packed up his things, and he took little Aggie and made his way with her to a little missionary port, getting ready to make their way back to Sweden. And he realized quickly this little, tiny, precious girl couldn't make the trip back. And maybe even just trying to forget all that had happened there, he gave her up for adoption to another couple, a missionary couple there at that port. And he headed back to Sweden, and he had given up on life, on following God, on living any sort of purpose out with his life, and he had given up. See, Aggie was adopted by this couple over that would bring her over to America where she would grow up. And one day, somebody sent Aggie this picture of a cross on a hill. Said, this is where your mom, Svea, is buried. And by the way, years ago when your parents were here, they led one little boy to Jesus. And that little boy continued to reach his village and continued to share about what your parents shared with him, with that entire village. And now more than 600 people are following Jesus because of this boy sharing what your parents had shared with him. Don't give up. She got to go share that story for the first time with her dad. She met him for the first time years later in Sweden. He'd given his life over to alcoholism. He could barely get up because of the liver damage. He couldn't get up out of his chair because he was just in such poor shape. And he started to apologize when he met her and say, I'm so sorry for all the things that I had to leave you behind and all these different things. And you grew up. And she said, no, Dad. It was worth it. There's 600 people following Jesus because of what you and Mom did. You made yourselves available. The crazy, amazing thing is that's not where that story ends. In her father's house, a few years later, she went to a missionary convention, and she heard a guy who was from the Congo there sharing about the ministry that God was doing through him and that he got to lead. And he said that over 110,000 believers had been baptized through this ministry, and there were great things happening. And she found the guy afterwards that had spoken, and she said, hey, do you know, I'm just curious, do you know David and Svea Flood? He said, know them. Svea led me to Jesus. And now I'm leading people to Jesus because they made themselves available. I've made myself available. That story continues. Remember that memo that Mr. Rogers wrote on? I love that after he wrote the script, he wrote in his own handwriting, it wasn't easy, but it was good. This I must remember. Must remember. See, Mr. Rogers started to write scripts again. Peter got out of the boat and swam to shore. And God isn't done with you or with me either. He's not done with us. So where does it start? What do we do? What does it look like? It looks simply like this. It looks like making ourselves available. Saying, God, I'm probably going to fail. I know I'm going to fail, but God, I want to make myself available to you. Where does that start? It doesn't mean you've got to be a superhero. It doesn't mean you've got to be all put together, but instead it says, God, I want to make myself available. Available. Pastor Mark last weekend challenged us to make ourselves available by just praying 5 minutes a day. Man, that is a great place to start. 5 minutes, what's that going to do? It's going to give you a chance to simply say, God, I'm available. God, would you step in? Would you use me? Would you do something great through my life in this world for your sake? Those 5 minutes might just simply be allowing Jesus to step into your failures and speak to you and tell you, I like you. Just you, yourself. It's you I like. So stop self-sabotaging because the world needs you. God can do it without you, but he's inviting you to be a part. And it just looks like saying this simple prayer: God, I know you're not done with me yet. I want to make myself available to you. I want to make myself available to you. If that's you today, would you stand with me as we close out this service and we just make this declaration together that I'm available to you, Jesus. God, I'm available to you because I know you're not done with me yet. I'm available to you. And would you just hold open your hands? And I want to pray over us as we go into this closing song. Jesus, thank you that you don't expect us to be a superhero. You don't expect us to wear a cape. But God, you invite us to just simply be available, to be used by you, to be open to you, to let you move in and through us, God, in greater ways than we could ever do on our own. God, you've invited us. So God, we just simply say, God, I'm available. Use me, God, in Jesus' name.